Hey guys, tonight we wake up on a bed of reeds, stiff as your dignity after crying in public, which by the way you're no longer allowed to do. Your back aches, your head throbs from yesterday's play fight, which ended with a dislocated shoulder and applause. The soup, it's black. You don't ask why, you're 7, you miss your mother. You whisper her name into a blanket that still smells like the barracks, sweat, smoke, and boys too young to be this angry. Outside, the cold is not just weather, it's policy. You tug your tunic tighter, not to stay warm, but to remember what softness used to feel like. Tonight, you train. Tomorrow, you bleed. By next year, if you're lucky, you'll learn to smile through both. Spoiler, you probably won't survive this, but at least you'll be inspiring. Before we dive into tonight's odd little adventure, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if this kind of weird storytelling truly speaks to you. And drop a comment to let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always a quiet joy imagining someone in Europe, the Americas, Asia, Africa, or wherever else, listening in from their own cozy corner of the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey us together. You take your first step into the training yard. The stones bite at your feet. A boy stares at you like your prey. And the instructor? He smiles. Not kindly, let the story begin. Section 1. Welcome to the world's worst baby shower. Congratulations, you've just been born. A squirming, screaming, vaguely potato-shaped thing. Your skin's still covered in ancestral slime, and you haven't even opened both eyes. And already, you're disappointing someone. They don't swaddle you, they evaluate you. A group of leathery old men in cloaks, who've survived more wars than warm embraces, begin poking you like you're a suspicious wedge of feta. One lifts your leg and frowns. Another sniffs, literally sniffs. A third taps your chest and mutters something about weak lungs. No one says congratulations. What they say is, meh. This is Sparta, where babies are like javelins, straight, sharp, and disposable if crooked. You are now undergoing what modern HR might call a performance review. Spartans called it selection. If you're not up to code, there's a lovely scenic place for you, the apotheti, a cliff, a pit, basically nature's delete button. You somehow pass, barely. Acceptable, one elder doors grunts, with all the warmth of a tax audit. Your mother, if she's in the room, says nothing. Love is not fashionable in this part of Greece. Neither is noise. You are not named, not yet. You are simply one standard-issue male infant, red-wrapped, unremarkable. Pending. A midwife, whose emotional range includes grunt and shrug, wipes you with what might be a training cloth or an ex-gladiator's toga. She mutters, "Hold still," as if newborns take direction. She places you on a mat that smells like goat sweat, iron and generational trauma. You cry, again, wrong move. Someone outside sneezes, someone inside farts, a dagger is sharpened. No one comforts you, which is perfect, because Sparta isn't raising a boy, it's breaking in a future corpse. Your father visits, he does not hold you, he does not smile, he looks at you like a general looks at a flawed helmet. Nods once, not pride, not affection, just logistics. He'll do. What? That's not your business. Your business is to grow, silently, correctly, violently if needed. By day 3, you've developed a cough, a fever, and a vague sense that emotions are best suppressed before they form fully. A 10-year-old boy wanders in, barefoot, holding a stick. He pokes you. Don't get used to food, he advises, with all the solemnity of a monk. You have to earn it. You don't know what food is, but you believe him. By day 4, you're still alive. That means you're now their problem, which is the closest thing to a birthday present you'll ever get. You're Spartan now, which means no softness, no warmth, no oopsies, just pain, protocol, and power. Ideally in that order. At night, you lie awake in your goat-scented cradle of grit, listening to the forge of Sparta shape everything, bones, boys, and obedience. A dog barks. A blade sings against stone. Somewhere someone is screaming. You stay quiet. In your tiny, squishy brain, one thought blooms like a weed. If I survive this, I might become something, not someone. Just something. But in that tiny animal brain of yours, something survives. Not hope, not joy, something weirder. A faint, dangerous suspicion that one day, maybe, someone might choose you not because you're useful, but because you're you. Ha! We'll beat that out of you soon enough. Historical fact: Spartan newborns were evaluated by elders to determine their physical fitness. If they were deemed unfit, they could be legally discarded, a form of state-sanctioned eugenics in ancient times. Fringe detail. Some accounts mention checking leg symmetry in infants, since misaligned legs suggested poor future combat ability. Open debate. Scholars still argue whether Sparta actually practiced infanticide systematically, or whether this narrative was exaggerated by the later writers to mythologize Spartan harshness. Section 2. Agogia is just another word for publicly funded sadism. They don't tell you why, they just take you. One morning someone calls your name, the one they haven't used in weeks, and you're marched away. No goodbye, no instructions, just the back of the boy in front of you. You are now in the agoge. You don't know what that means yet. But your hair is gone, your shoes are gone, and your name is starting to feel optional. They give you a cloak. Red, itchy, smells like other boys, older boys, gone boys. No shoes, no bedding, no privacy. You sleep in a pile. Warmth is collective. Pain is personal. The floor is straw, rushes, and sweat. One night you wake up with someone's foot in your mouth. The next night it's there sobbing. You don't ask questions. You pretend you didn't hear. That's lesson 1. They don't teach with words. They teach with absence. Absence of food, of comfort, of mother tongue. You begin to forget what your voice sounds like. You go days without speaking, weeks without being called anything except you. You're not punished for stealing, not directly, but someone is always punished. And no one ever admits to being full. You start looking at crumbs like currency. One boy is caught chewing too loudly. Not stealing, just chewing. The whip comes anyway. 4 lashes, publicly, not for the act, for the audacity of needing. You learn. Sometimes the trainers walk past holding meat. Just to see what you'll do, you don't blink, you don't drool, you don't ask. You stare forward like a statue of someone less hungry. This, they say, is discipline. But it feels more like theatre, and you're part of the set. Fighting is mandatory. You fight before meals, after runs, between chores. There are no teams, just opportunity. You learn to spot the weak ones, then the cocky ones, then the quiet ones who strike low. You don't always win. That's fine. What matters is that you don't complain. Or bleed in public. At night, the dormitory is a swamp of breath and twitching legs. Boys sleep curled around their pain like it might hatch into strength. One stops waking up. No one says it. No one asks. The straw is rearranged. That's all. By week 3, you don't walk. You march. You don't speak. You gesture. You don't eat. You manage. By month 2, you've forgotten the sound of your own name. By month 4, you stop caring. You're not a boy anymore. You're a group, a task, a preparation. You're becoming something, but you don't know what. Not yet. Historical fact. The agoge was the Spartan state-run education system where boys, from age 7, were trained in obedience, endurance, and military discipline. Fringe detail. Boys often slept in groups on straw or rushes without blankets or privacy, to build camaraderie and suppress individualism. Open debate. Some historians question whether the agoge was truly as severe and uniform as described, or if many elements were romanticized or dramatized by later writers. Section 3. How to starve with style and still get whipped. You haven't had a full meal in days. Correction, you've never had a full meal, not since they tossed you into agoge and called it education. Here, eating is a privilege. Starvation is part of the syllabus. And stealing? Well, that's extra credit. Today's breakfast is a whisper of barley, literally in a woi. It's thin enough to see your own reflection in the gruel, which is helpful because mirrors aren't part of military training. There's a crust of bread that tastes like regret and salt. You chew it until your gums bleed, not because it's tough, because your gums are soft from hunger. You have fantasies now, not of girls, not of glory, of food. You dream of figs soaked in oil, of onions roasted in ash, of lentils, sweet, hot, and spoonable. Last night you tried to chew your blanket. It didn't help. They say, if you want more food, earn it. You ask how, they say, steal it. You ask what happens if you get caught. They say nothing, they just smile, and that silence tastes worse than the bread. You plan your heist like a tiny war. Target, barley bun. Location, cook's tent. Obstacle, One-eyed dog named Menelaus who hates children and carbs. You move like a shadow, you breathe like a ghost. You steal the bun, it's warm, still steaming, you nearly weep, but before your fingers finish their victory prayer, the cook steps out. He sees the crumbs on the table, he sees you chewing, he sees your eyes, wide, guilty, gluing with premature carbohydrate joy. They don't ask, they don't scold, they call the trainer. He brings the whip. You're stripped. Again, you kneel. Again, the dirt is warm today. A blessing. You almost thank it. The first lash bites. The second carves. By the 5th, you lose track of numbers. By the 10th, you lose track of yourself. You try not to scream. Screaming is for the untrained. Instead, you clench your jaw and imagine lentils. It almost works. The others watch. Some smirk. Some pretend not to care. One stares too long. You'll remember that. Later, when it's his turn, you'll stare too. This is Sparta. We share everything, even humiliation. Afterward, they feed you. Not food, instruction. Next time, don't get caught. They call it a lesson. You call it Tuesday. You lie on your back that night, ribs on fire. Your stolen meal still churns in your gut like a guilty secret. Someone next to you passes a piece of boiled garlic under the cloak. You don't ask where it came from. You don't say thank you, you just eat. Because gratitude is dangerous, gratitude is remembered. And remembered things get punished. You learn stealth like a second language. How to walk without sound, how to spot shadows where none should be. How to chew without joy. You start thinking like a thief, even when you're not stealing. You are always stealing. Even chance, even warmth, dear. It all has a price. You steal a radish from a helot hut. It's bitter, dirty. You cry while eating it. Not because it tastes bad, because it's the first time you've eaten alone, in secret, without being punished. And that, more than the beatings, is what breaks you. Historical fact. Spartan boys were deliberately underfed in the Agoj and expected to steal to supplement their rations, as a way to train cunning and resourcefulness. Fringe detail. Some sources mention boys being whipped publicly during festivals like the Diamastigosis, where the crowd cheered as they bled, a kind of patriotic spectacle. Open debate. Some scholars question whether the steal or starve rule was truly systematized, or whether it became a symbolic tale repeated to romanticize Spartan toughness. Section 4. Group therapy via fistfight. You've survived the cold, you've outsmarted the cook, you've learned to chew without making noise, breathe without making waves, and sleep without expecting comfort. But now it's time to learn the most sacred Spartan art. Punching the people you live with. They call it training, but it looks a lot like legalized child-on-child violence. The rules are simple, no whining, no biting, in front of the trainers. If you cry, cry into the dirt. That way no one hears, that way it doesn't count. Your opponent is a friend, or was, or will be, it's hard to tell. In Sparta, relationships are more like weather patterns, temporary, unpredictable, occasionally fatal. You fight in the dirt, in front of everyone. No armor, no time limit, no safe words, just fists, feet, elbows, teeth if you're pestilent. The crowd watches. The trainers smile. You bleed, they nod, you win, they shrug, you lose. They say, try again tomorrow. The one kid gets knocked out. Not because he was weak, he was distracted. He looked up. At what? No one knows. But for that half second, his jaw was open and fate walked in. They drag him out of the ring, dust him off, give him a new opponent. No rest. This is about resilience, not safety. Another kid breaks a finger. They bind it with goat sinew and send him back in. You start memorizing bruises like geography. A purple galaxy across someone's ribs. A red sun blooming under an eye. Your own arms painted like a map of mistakes. You learn to love the hits, not in a poetic way, in a survival way. Each bruise is a conversation. Don't trust too quickly. Don't look away. Don't show kindness unless you can weaponize it. You nod, you bruise, you internalize. At night, the dawn breathes like a wounded animal. Boys twitch in their sleep, some mutter, some weep silently, the new ones. The rest of you dream of fists, not out of fear, out of rhythm. You dream of what your hand did today, of how it moved before your heart had time to disagree. You wake up with your jaw clenched, your knuckles sore, your mind strangely clear. One boy tries to joke about it. Next time I punch you, he says, I'll aim for the part that still feels. No one laughs, but someone smiles. The strange thing is, the next day you fight that boy, and when it ends, your lip split, his knuckles swollen, you sit together, you share a piece of stale bread, neither of you speaks, but the silence feels almost warm. This is as close as it gets to intimacy here. Two people, battered, breathing, and briefly not enemies. One day a boy doesn't get up. You think he's just tired. You nudge him, no response. The trainer does not shout. He simply orders the body moved. The match continues. That night no one speaks, not because they're afraid, because they're thinking, what if that was me? The next morning one boy volunteers to go first. He loses, badly, but he gets up. You don't know if that makes him brave or stupid, but for a moment you want to be like him. You'll forget that feeling later, but not yet. Historical fact: Spartan boys were expected to fight regularly, often with minimal supervision. These matches were considered essential training for combat and discipline. Fringe detail: ancient accounts describe some of these training fights as brutal and often continuing until one boy couldn't stand. Open debate. Scholars debate whether these sparring matches were truly constant and state-enforced, or whether later writers exaggerated them to glorify Spartan brutality. Section 5. Smile, you're bleeding. The first time you split your lip, it stings. The second time you smile, not because it hurts less, but it doesn't, but because now you know pain is part of the uniform. There's no ceremony, no graduation, no moment when someone says, "You've made it." But one day your trainer punches you square in the stomach and you don't fall. You just wheeze, straighten up and nod. He nods back, you've arrived. Here, stoicism isn't philosophy, it's posture. If your shoulder's dislocated, pop it back. If your foot's infected, walk until it goes numb. You don't complain, you don't react, you turn your injuries into performance art. You start laughing during fights. It confuses people, it unleashes, it makes you feel invincible. Until someone laughs back. Then it's terrifying. You learn to walk while limping, talk while bleeding, and stand still while your body shakes. One boy bites off a chunk of his own tongue in a fall. He doesn't spit it out. He swallows it. They call him disciplined. You call him gone. Every bruise becomes a badge, every scar a signature. But no one shows them off. That would imply pride. And pride is just another kind of noise. You start wearing your pain like a beckoned skin. The cloak scratches your back raw where you stop noticing. Your foot splits on a rock. You keep marching. You crack a rib. No one asks. So you don't tell. You sleep with your arm pressed against your chest, hoping it resets itself by dawn. The strange part? You start to miss the hurt when it's gone. Comfort feels suspicious. Stillness feels fake. Kindness feels like bait. A helot once tries to offer you a fig. He shouldn't. You slap it out of his hand, not because you're angry, but because you're scared of what it means to accept softness. Later that night, you dream of the fig. You wake up furious with yourself. Your instructor tells a story of a boy who stood still while a fox gnawed his stomach. He smiled. He died. A legend. You wonder if the fox was ever real. You wonder if the boy wanted to be. There's a festival this week in Diamastagosis. You line up shirtless. So do a dozen other boys. The whips are ceremonial. The pain is not. The crowd cheers. Some are helots, some are citizens, some are both. You're not sure who enjoys this more. You hold your posture through the first 5 lashes. By the 8th, your knees give slightly. By the 10th, you lock your eyes with the boy next to you. He grins through blood. So you do too. It's the closest thing to religion you've felt here. Historical fact. Spartans praised stoicism and pain tolerance, idolizing boys who could endure beatings without flinching, especially in public festivals like Diamastagosis. Fringe detail. One apocryphal tale tells of a Spartan boy who let a fox gnaw through his stomach rather than confess to stealing it. He smiled and died silently. Open debate. Many historians argue whether the glorification of silent suffering was a genuine cultural value or a retroactive myth to excuse institutional brutality. Section 6. Murder Practice Teen Edition. You're older now, not in years, time doesn't pass here, it hardens. But your body is sharper, your mind quieter. You walk like a blade with legs. So they hand you a knife, not ceremonially, not dramatically. They just hand it to you one day, like a lunch pail or a broom. Take it, they say. It's time. Time for what? They don't answer. You're told it's part of the crypteia, a rite, a mission, a test. The rules are simple. Go out at night. Stay hidden. Don't return empty-handed. What they mean is, find a helot. Kill him. Don't get caught. You want to ask why? Why him? Why now? Why do it in the dark? But you've learnt the most Spartan lesson of all. If you don't want an answer, don't ask a question. So you go. You slip through fields, past sleeping pigs, past snoring huts. You hear someone singing to themselves. A helot elder, maybe drunk, maybe mad. They don't see you, they don't need to. You're the ghost Sparta taught to haunt its own labour force. You spot your target, a man with a limp, a farmer maybe. His back is bent like a question he was never allowed to ask. He's not armed, he's not running, he's just walking. You grip the knife, your fingers tremble, not because you can't, but because you can. And that makes it worse. You step closer. He turns, he sees you, and, curse him, he smiles, not warmly, not stupidly, just like someone who's seen enough young boys with sharp metal to know what happens next. You hesitate. He doesn't run. You wonder if he wants it, or if he just knows it doesn't matter. You do what you were told, then you run, faster than you thought possible. Not from guilt, not from him, from the silence he left behind. When you return, they don't ask what happened. They look at your knife, they nod, they move on. You're not praised. You're absorbed, folded deeper into the myth. At night, you clean the blade. You pretend it's just sweat on your hands, but you know better. You name the man, quietly, something simple, something soft, you forget it by morning. Later, they take you to a public square. Statues everywhere. Warriors, kings, gods. They point at one and say, like him. You stare at the marble face, it's flawless, empty, cold. You touch your own. Still warm, still human, for now. Historical fact, the Crypteia was a real Spartan institution where elite youths were sent out to kill helots, the enslaved underclass, under the guise of controlling potential rebellion. Fringe detail. Some sources suggest these killings happened during moonless nights and targeted the strongest, smartest helots to prevent uprisings. Open debate. Scholars continue to debate whether Crypteia was a state-sanctioned death squad or a highly mythologized legend exaggerated by hostile non-Spartan writers. Section 7. You're only somebody if everybody else dies. The battlefield is coming. You don't know when, you don't know where, but you've been practicing your heroic pose since puberty, shoulders back, chin high, cloak fluttering, all for the chance to die decoratively. Because in Sparta, greatness isn't measured by what you build, only by what you outlive, and preferably how splashy your death was in front of witnesses. You spend your mornings marching and your nights fantasizing about the perfect obituary. Fell bravely at the front, shield never dropped, smiled through the spear. Because that's what matters at Isdell over survival. They don't teach you strategy, they teach you choreography. Fall dramatically, bleed with symmetry, die in a way that looks good on pottery. You're not trained to win, you're trained to be remembered. And not for kindness, not for cleverness, just for not flinching when someone else dies before you do. You hear stories of the one who dropped his spear and was ghosted by society, of the one who limped home and was exiled to goat duty, of the one who cried during formation and had his name erased like a scribbled mistake. They call them cowards. You call them alive. One day they make you stand in a line. Bronze gleaming, faces blank. A parade, they say. For unity, for pride, for propaganda. The crowd cheers. You don't blink. You try to think of something profound. All that comes is, please notice me. The commander recites a list of names. Not the living, the dead. The dead get titles, the dead get songs. The dead get adjectives like valiant, loyal, and worthy. You, meanwhile, get to hold a spear and contemplate your irrelevance. You begin to understand that in Sparta, existence is marketing, and death is your only shot at going viral. You fake a limp for 2 days just to see if someone asks. No one does. You spar harder, shout louder, smile when your nose breaks. It works, a little. Someone says, he's got grit, then you replay that phrase in your head all night, like a love letter from a god who doesn't know your name. Another boy breaks his arm during drills. He doesn't scream. They chant his name like it's a hymn. They forget your name by breakfast. You start taking notes. You train for pain like others train for applause. Not because you're tough, because you're terrified of being forgettable. One night you hear someone whisper, "What if I die and no one sings about it?" You don't respond, because you're thinking the same thing, because you're afraid your death will be practical, necessary, clean, unstoried, The worst kind. You write your own eulogy in your head. Short, grand, ideally inaccurate. You hope it will be inscribed somewhere. Not on a statue, not on stone, but maybe in a joke someone tells at a drinking party a decade after you're gone. It's enough, maybe. Historical fact, Spartan culture tied honour and status to military achievement. Cowards were punished with social death, no marriage, no meals, no name, no fringe details. So-called tremblers were forbidden from even washing at the public baths. Cleanliness, like memory, was reserved for the brave. Open debate. Some historians argue this obsession with posthumous glory says more about those writing the history than the people who lived it, and died quietly anyway. Section 8. Congratulations, you're a hollow statue, or you've won nothing, but you look amazing doing it. You've made it. You walk straighter. You talk slower. You don't blink unless it's functional. No one calls you boy anymore. They call you Spartan, which is just a fancy way of saying dead inside but upright. You look at your reflection in bronze. It's clean, strong, iconic, a jawline with purpose, a scar with direction, eyes that no longer ask why. You've become everything they wanted, and nothing you recognize. There's a ceremony. Not for you exactly, for what you now represent. They hand you a shield and call it an extension of your honor. They hand you a sword and call it the voice of your will. They hand you silence and call it manhood. You take them all, because rejecting them would mean asking what else there is, and that's dangerous. You no longer flinch when the whip cracks. You no longer hunger when rations are thin. You no longer care if someone dies beside you, unless it makes the line uneven. You are efficient. You are respected. You are admired. You miss being seen. A helot bows too low when handing you water. You don't punish him. You just don't acknowledge him. That's the new cruelty. The refined kind. The kind you've been sculpted for. Your smile is perfect now and symmetrical, restrained. It appears during drills, during inspections, during ceremonies, never during meals, never in dreams. You don't dream, not because you're disciplined, but because the part of you that used to imagine things no longer reports for duty. You hear about a boy who tried to run away. They say he made it to the hills before the hounds got him. You don't feel anything, not sorrow, not relief, just nothing. And that's when you know it's complete. You are finished. There's a statue going up in the agora, not of you, but it might as well be. It's got your posture, your blank expression. Your tightly gripped spear, it doesn't look alive, which means they got it right. People pass by the statue and say, he stood for something. They don't ask what. Because the point was never the meaning. The point was the marble. You start referring to yourself in third person, not out loud, in thought. You think, he did well today. You think he didn't falter. It helps. It means you don't have to reconcile who you were with who you've become. One boy, younger, softer, asks you, does it feel good to be honoured? You say, it feels like being done, and then he doesn't understand. You envy him for that. You see a group of children laughing in the market. They run like they have nowhere to be, like joy is real. You remember running like that. Then you remember stopping. You don't feel sad, you just notice. You sharpen your blade that night. Not because it's dull, because it's ritual. You don't need it to be sharp, you need it to be known. That you're still ready, that you're still useful, that if someone said now, you'd move before they finished the sentence. This is what you are now. A response, a function, a statue that breathes. They say Sparta has no poets. That's not true. You're a poem. You're just not allowed to rhyme. Historical fact. Spartan men who completed the agoj became full citizens at age 30, expected to embody the state's ideals of restraint, silence, and martial superiority. Fringe detail. Spartans often commissioned statues and inscriptions not of individual men, but of archetypes, perfect anonymous warriors meant to symbolize the collective. Open debate. Scholars still argue whether the emotional suppression of Spartans was genuine culture or later mythologizing by outsiders obsessed with idolized masculinity. Section 9. Crying is for helots, unless no one's watching. It's night. No war, no drill, no knife to sharpen, just silence, thick, unassigned. You sit alone beneath a fig tree. Not to rest, not to pray, just to be where no one told you to be. And for the first time in years, you don't know what to do with your hands. A breeze touches your face. It feels wrong. It's not carrying orders, not lifting dust. It's just soft. and that softness feels like sabotage. You shift in place, check your surroundings. No one's watching. You let your shoulders drop a little. Then a sound, not distant, not official, just a human sound. A hiccup, a breath, a tremble. You freeze. It's coming from the other side of the tree. You lean closer. There's a boy, maybe 15. New cloak, unscarred knuckles, his face buried in his knees. He's not making a scene. He's making himself small. He thinks no one can see. You've been him. You step back, silently, slowly. You don't want to interrupt the ritual, because you remember, we only cry when we think no one's left to kill us for it. You return to your side of the tree. You sit. You say nothing. The wind rustles. The boy hiccups again. You hear him try to stop, and something inside you doesn't want him to. You wonder when was the last time you cried. Not from pain, not from rage, from remembering. You can't. You try to imagine your mother's voice. All that comes is a command. You used to believe that silence made you strong. Now you wonder if it just made you invisible. The boy stands. You don't look at him, but you hear his footsteps shuffle, ashamed, angry, embarrassed. He walks away. You remain, not because you're stronger, because you're still afraid to cry. That night you lie awake. No dreams, of course, but your eyes sting. Maybe from the wind, maybe not. You remember the phrase, crying is for helots, but the helots know grief. They sing it, bury it, pass it on. You were trained to store it, like a debt Sparta will never repay. You wake the next morning, your cloak smells like dust and dried sweat. You're the same, but you walk slower. Not from injury, from weight. Something you didn't carry yesterday. You see the boy later. He doesn't meet your eyes. You don't nod. You don't speak. But as you pass, you loosen your grip on the shield just enough for him to notice. It's not kindness. It's not permission. It's recognition. And here, that's sacred. Historical fact. Spartan boys were trained to suppress emotion, especially grief. Public weeping was associated with weakness or servitude, often attributed to helots. Fringe detail. Despite this, Spartans allowed intense mourning for fallen kings, an exception revealing the complexity and hypocrisy in their emotional norms. Open debate. Scholars argue whether Spartan stoicism truly erased emotion, or simply relocated it to private, unrecorded places, like the inside of a helmet. Section 10. You're not a hero. You're what was left over, or the echo that didn't end in applause. You didn't die in battle. You didn't throw yourself on a spear. You didn't scream a glorious name. You just stayed alive. You weren't chosen. You weren't cursed. You were simply not eliminated. And in Sparta, that makes you no one in particular. You eat alone now, not by punishment, by default. The boys you trained with. Some are statues, some are stories, some are gone. You're still here. Congratulations. People nod when they see you. Not out of reverence, out of habit. You're a fixture, a shape, a symbol of what happens when the machine doesn't break you, but doesn't know what to do with you after. A child points at you and says, "Is that a soldier?" The mother shrugs. He was. No one says your name anymore, because there's no occasion to. You weren't first, you weren't best, you were there. The kind of man who filled the silence between legends. Sometimes younger recruits ask you for advice. You want to say, run, or don't forget how to laugh, but you don't. You say what you were trained to say, hold your line. They nod. They thank you. You hate that it feels like lying. Your body hurts in new places, not from training, from time. Your hands no longer remember why they were always clenched. You don't fight anymore, not because you don't want to, because no one asks you to. You visit the training grounds, watch them spar, watch them scream. You remember the moves, but not the purpose. A boy falls, he laughs, he gets back up. You feel something you can't name. It's not pride, it's not regret, it's recognition. Later you sit alone near the river, the same one they say the weak were thrown into at birth. You wonder, not for the first time, whether surviving was the harder test. You think of the boy under the fig tree, of the one who smiled while bleeding, of the name you whispered over a helot's body and forgot by morning. You carry them all, not as guilt, as weight, and for the first time in years, it doesn't feel heavy. It just exists. One morning, someone calls for you, not with urgency, with formality. You report to the council, you assume it's an error. They ask for your opinion. on a matter of defense, of tactics, of the young. You blink, you say something functional, expected. They nod, you're dismissed. But that night a recruit approaches. You said something wise, he says. You try to remember what you said. You can't. It wasn't wisdom, it was reflex. But the boy looks relieved, grateful. You envy him. Not his ignorance, his hope. You wonder what he'll become. You wonder if he'll survive. You wonder if survival is still the right word. You pass the statue again, the one that looks like you or like everyone. It hasn't changed, but you have. You feel the wind again. This time it doesn't scare you. It brushes your cheek like a memory with no name. You stand still, not because someone told you to, because you chose to. You're not a hero. You're not a villain. You're what was left over after the story's ended. And somehow, in the quiet, that's enough. Historical fact: Spartan men who survived without distinction often faded from public memory, while heroism was reserved for the dead, especially those who died in battle. Fringe detail: there were no statues for the average soldier, only group graves, anonymous formations, or collective shrines. Open debate. Historians still question whether Sparta truly discarded its survivors, or whether this narrative of heroic death was a later romanticization imposed by others. Wind down, the softness beneath, or you woke up and that was enough. You open your eyes, there's no blood on your hands, no spear, no whip. Softness of a pillow that actually forgives your neck. The air doesn't taste like iron, it smells like morning. You blink. You're not in Sparta. You're not a weapon. You're a human being, waking up in a time where pain isn't proof of worth and silence isn't mandatory. You stretch. No one is grading your posture. You inhale. No one is watching your breath for weakness. You exist, without assignment, without orders, without needing to impress a statue. Your body carries stories, some written by others, some you carved yourself, but now you get to choose what kind of page today becomes. You look out the window, you see someone smile, you don't brace for the worst, you feel it. This world is not Sparta, and that's a good thing. Maybe there are still battles, deadlines, doubts, dull routines, but today no one is asking you to be hollow. You can feel, you can rest, you can breathe, not to survive, but simply because it's beautiful to do so. You made it. You woke up. And that's enough to begin again, gently. Chapter 1. The Boy with a Limp. The boy was born small and with a twisted leg, a limp that never healed, no matter how many herbs the nurse crushed or how many prayers his mother whispered to Artemis. In Sparta, that should have been the end of him. A malformed child was not a child, he was a liability, but this was no ordinary boy, and this was no ordinary time. His name was Agesilaus, and his blood ran with royal trace, just trace, enough to matter, but not enough to protect him. His half-brother was already king, Agis II, tall and broad and perfect, the kind of man poets found easy to praise. Agesilaus was his shadow, and like all shadows he learned to move in silence, to listen, and to wait. He entered the agoge, the brutal Spartan training system, later than most. There were whispers that he wouldn't survive it. The other boys taunted him. Not always with words. Spartans were trained not to speak unless necessary, but with glances, with bruises left in places adults wouldn't see. He limped, but never begged. He bled, but never cried. One night after a drill in winter rain, a tutor found him kneeling in the mud, reciting the names of past kings to himself. "Why do you suffer this?" the man asked. Agesilaus looked up, not blinking. "Because one day I might be one of them." They laughed at first, but the boy kept rising. In wrestling, he used his low center of gravity to win. In endurance, he refused to collapse. In silence, he sharpened his mind until it could cut through orders like a spear. What he lacked in stride, he made up for in strategy. And what he lacked in strength, he replaced with an unshakable certainty that he would matter. By adolescence, he was no longer mocked. He was tolerated. By adulthood, he was respected. Barely. He walked with a sec, not because he needed it, but because it reminded people that he'd made peace with imperfection. In a city where everyone pretended to be invincible, Agesilaus made vulnerability his weapon. Then came Lysander. Lysander was not royal, not even close. He was a general, a star risen from war, brilliant, enigmatic, and far more dangerous than the Ephors realized. He'd helped end the Peloponnesian War, led the Spartan fleet to victory, and returned with not just spoils but influence. He admired Agesilaus, not for his limp, for his loyalty, for his silence, for the way he didn't threaten, yet understood how power moved. One evening under a pale moon near the Eurotas River, Lysander spoke plainly. "You do not smile much," he said. "Smiling is for men who have arrived," Agesilaus answered. "I'm still walking." Lysander nodded. "Then I'll make sure the path is clear." At the time, Aegisthus Kiln still wore the crown, but he was sick, coughing blood into linens embroidered with Sparta's twin symbols. His son Leotychidas was expected to succeed him, except rumours whispered that Leotychidas might not be Aegis's true son, that he might be sired by Alcibiades, the infamous Athenian exile who once seduced friends, foes, and cities alike. In Sparta, that kind of impurity could cost a crown. The law was clear. Only men of pure Heraclid blood could rule. But the law was also flexible, if interpreted by the right people at the right time. Lysander saw an opportunity. Agesilaus was royal enough, loyal enough, weak in body but strong in will, perfect in a way only a master strategist would understand. The priests at Delphi were consulted. They returned with an ambiguous oracle. "Beware a lame reign," the ephors debated. Some laughed, some hesitated. Lysander leaned in. "It does not say a lame man, it says a lame reign. And what reign would be more crippled than one born of impurity?" That was enough. When Agis died, Sparta broke tradition and crowned the boy with the limp. Agesilaus did not weep. He did not cheer. He merely stood taller, or tried to, and asked for a simple wooden staff, not a golden scepter. He walked himself to the temple, offered his own sacrifice, and slept on a straw mat that night, just like his soldiers. But beneath that humility burned the embers of resolve. He had clawed his way past fate, past prejudice, past the perfect men whose bones now lined the roads of old campaigns. He was king, and if Sparta expected a cripple, it would soon meet a commander. The crown was his, but in Sparta the crown was never enough. Tomorrow the world would test him. Tonight, the boy who limped through war dreams of marching to Persia. Chapter 2. A crown not meant for him. The crown was never meant for him. Even as the ceremonial laurel was pressed into his hair, no gold circlet, not in Sparta, Agesilaus felt the weight not of honour but of absence. His brother Agis was dead. His nephew Leotychidas stood stalwart in the shadows, eyes gleaming not with grief, but with calculation. The throne had passed sideways, not down. Sparta did not speak openly of such things. But the court was a forest of whispers. Some called it fate, others called it theft. Either way, the city had two kings, and now only one remained, a limping man raised more by hardship than birthright. Lysander stood behind him, arms folded, the architect of this quiet coup. It was he who had seeded doubt about Leotychidas's parentage. He who had carried the Delphic oracle like a dagger into the chamber of the ephors. He who had framed Agesilaus as a safer choice, modest, moldable, loyal. For a while that was true. Agesilaus, newly crowned, did not swagger. He walked among the soldiers in the same tunic he had worn the day before. He listened more than he spoke, and when he did speak, it was often to ask what others needed: food, shoes, quiet. He attended every training session, every sacrifice, every death announcement. It made him popular. Dangerous men often are when they pretend to be harmless. But Agesilaus was never harmless. He was watching, always watching. He saw the way the council eyed him, with one brow raised, with fingers tapping nervously. He saw the way Lysander stood just a little too close when strategies were discussed. And he saw Leotychidas, not sulking but waiting, as if the crown had merely been borrowed. 3 months into his reign, the ephors summoned him privately. "Athens rises again," said one. "They've rearmed," said another. "Ships, silver, allies." "Thebes is stirring," added a third, "and the Persians have begun to take sides." Agesilaus said nothing for a moment. Then, "So we wait until they finish arming?" That was not a question. The ephors blinked. "You propose action?" asked the eldest. "I propose Sparta," he replied, "and Sparta does not wait." They murmured, half in approval, half in dread. War had made Sparta strong, but it had also made it brittle. For too long they had ruled by fear, not by favour. Their allies were growing resentful, their enemies bold, and now Persia, that old eastern storm, was funding Athens and Thebes alike. Agesilaus proposed something mad. "We must take the war to Asia," he said. "Strike Persia before it finishes rearming the world against us." Gasps. "No Spartan king has ever crossed the sea," one Ephor protested. "No Spartan king," said Agesilaus softly, "has ever worn sandals in the mud with his soldiers either." He had them. Not all, but enough. The expedition would be small. Spartan in every sense. Lean, swift, disciplined. He would lead it personally. And Lysander, hungry for relevance, would go with him. The plan was to liberate the Ionian cities from Persian control. That was the story they told. But Agesilaus carried another vision. One forged not in prophecy, but in pain. He wanted Sparta to matter beyond the peninsula, to lead Greece not just in war, but in meaning, and perhaps to leave something behind greater than discipline and death. Before he left, he walked the perimeter of the training grounds where boys wrestled in dust. One of them, broad-shouldered and wild-eyed, limped slightly from a recent break. Agesilaus approached. The boy froze. "Still hurts?" the king asked. The boy nodded. "Good," he said. "That means you're becoming something stronger than a soldier." He left at dawn. The ships were simple, the warriors few, but in their eyes burned the old Lacedaemonian flame. And in Agesilaus, for the first time, Sparta had a king who would command not from behind the phalanx, but from its heart. As the sails filled with wind and the coast shrank behind them, Lysander approached. "You know the real reason I supported you?" he asked. Agesilaus kept his eyes on the horizon. "Because I was useful." "No," said Lysander. "Because you weren't loved. Loved kings get sloppy. Feared kings get soft. But ignored kings, they learn how to last." Agesilaus said nothing. But in that silence something settled, between two men who both knew the weight of being underestimated. They would reach Asia soon. They would strike deeper than Sparta ever had. And the world, for better or worse, would learn the name of the king who limped across the sea. Chapter 3. The King Who Walked Without Shoes. They called him the Barefoot King. It wasn't a metaphor. Agesilaus literally walked without sandals, through city streets, across muddy fields, among soldiers who stared at his feet more than his crown. In Sparta, where tradition was carved in bone, this was more shocking than a battlefield wound. He did it not to provoke. He did it because it was who he had always been. Sparta had grown fat on fear. Other city-states bowed out of habit. Tributes flowed, helots tilled, and generals drank from foreign cups. Victory in the Peloponnesian War had made them rulers of Greece, and nothing decays faster than triumph left untested. Agesilaus wanted to be tested. In Asia he found what he was looking for. The cities of Ionia welcomed him with mixed eyes, some grateful, some suspicious. These were Greeks under Persian rule, and they had learned that every liberator eventually builds a new cage. Agesilaus spoke little. He offered no declarations. He walked the agora like a commoner, ate from soldier pots, and refused gifts from local elites. When a governor offered him a gold-fringed robe, he smiled and said, "It would look worse on me than it does on you." His men adored him. They had never known a king who stood in line for water, or who slept beside them without a tent, or who knew the name of their fathers. But Agesilaus had not come to charm. He had come to conquer, though he would never use that word. The Persian satraps, alarmed by the Spartan incursion, began sending armies, not large ones. They underestimated him. They assumed he was a figurehead, a Spartan puppet pulled by the strings of Lysander. They learned otherwise. At the Battle of Sardis, Agesilaus drew the Persians into flatlands, then crushed them with a wedge of disciplined hoplites, not because he had more men, but because his men knew why they marched. Every order was precise, every step planned. When the dust cleared, the Persians fled, and the Ionians began carving his name into their temple walls. Lysander, watching, grew restless. He had expected to be the mind behind the mission. But Agesilaus was no puppet. He consulted Lysander, praised him in public, but acted alone. When soldiers began to cheering Lysander's name louder than his own, Agesilaus did something bold. He reassigned Lysander, quietly, without fanfare, a a soft exile hidden in diplomacy. Lysander left with a tight smile and a heavier heart. He had made a king turn, and now the king had reminded him who ruled. Later, in a letter to a friend, Agesilaus would write, "No man can serve Sparta and himself at the same time. One must be removed." Still, the victories kept coming. City after city opened its gates. Not all were taken by force, some by respect. Even Persian agents began to whisper that this one-legged general was different. Not greedy, not cruel, just relentless. And then came the message. From home, the Athenian navy had rebuilt. Thebes had grown bold. Corinth was stirring. A new alliance funded by Persian gold was forming against Sparta. The war was coming back. Agesilaus stood alone when he read the message. His army rested nearby, the air thick with summer and the smell of figs. He looked east toward lands not yet marched. He looked west toward a homeland unravelling. He chose the harder path. "Sparta calls," he told his men, "we return." No one cheered. They didn't need to. Their king had taught them that glory wasn't noise, it was action. Before they left, a local noble offered Agesilaus a statue in his honour. He declined. "If my shadow lingers," he said, "let it be in the dust of the road I walked, not in the marble others build." They boarded ships at Ephesus. As the sails unfurled, Agesilaus stood barefoot on the deck, watching the coastline shrink. He carried no trophies, no silks, only scars, and the quiet knowledge that while Persia had not been broken, it had been warned. At sea, a soldier asked him why he never wore armour in camp. "Because I am safer among my men than behind any bronze," he said. Back in Greece, the storm was already building. Athens, Thebes, Corinth, Argos, cities that once knelt now bristled. The land he returned to was not the one he left. But Agesilaus? He had changed too. He no longer needed to prove he was a king. He had walked without shoes, and left footprints the empire would feel for years to come. Chapter 4. To Persia, without permission. He did not ask. He simply went. When Agesilaus first proposed the idea of marching on Persia, it was dismissed as symbolic, a gesture, a way to rattle spears and remind Athens who still held the longest shadow in Greece. No one expected him to actually cross the sea, certainly not the Ephors, not even Lysander. But Agesilaus did not wait for consensus. He waited for opportunity. He took just 2,000 men, a mere shard of Sparta's strength, not enough for conquest, just enough to strike, to be noticed, to sow the seed of fear that the Spartan arm might stretch farther than anyone thought, even eastward, even into the heart of empire. He landed at Ephesus in the spring. The port smelled of salt and figs and rebellion. Ionian cities had lived too long under Persian governors. Some still bowed out of habit. Others watched the approaching Spartan king and felt a flicker of hope, or dread. They couldn't tell which. Agesilaus did not give speeches. He did not ride in chariots or parade through streets. He walked beside his men, past mosaics and market stalls, through temple courtyards, until he found the Persian magistrates' quarters. Then he stood there, in silence, until the door opened. He did not need an army to deliver his first message. He only needed to be seen. The Persian response was swift. A satrap named Tissaphernes sent spies, then soldiers, then an envoy. The envoy asked for parley. Agesilaus agreed, but brought no wine, only maps. Tissaphernes promised peace if Sparta withdrew. Agesilaus nodded, then attacked. Not the capital, not the cities, the horses. He struck the Persian cavalry garrisons at the edges, burned stables, freed livestock, dismantled supply lines. It was brutal, efficient, the kind of war the Persians weren't used to fighting. They had expected banners and declarations. They got fire in the night and hoofbeats fleeing into the mountains. In one battle near the Meander River, his men faced a Persian force twice their size. Agesilaus arranged his hoplites not in the traditional phalanx, but in scattered formations designed to break cavalry charges. The Persians laughed until their horses screamed and buckled under Spartan spears. The survivors fled. The locals began to whisper his name, the small man with the crooked leg and the cruel efficiency. Word reached Artaxerxes, king of kings in Susa. Persia was burning at its edges, and worse, it wasn't even a full war, it was a message. The Persian counterplay was subtle. They offered gold, not to Agesilaus, but to Athens, to Thebes, to Corinth, to Argos. Old enemies, once broken, now revived. For Persia understood what Sparta had forgotten, that the longest war is always the one fought at home. Agesilaus received the news in midsummer. He was camped near Sardis, preparing a strike inland. A messenger arrived on horseback, bloody with exhaustion. "Athens is building again," he said, "with Persian gold." Agesilaus did not speak for a full minute, then simply, "Of course." He gathered his officers. In the flickering firelight they asked him what came next. "Victory," he said, "but not here. He meant to go home, not in defeat, but in redirection." He left behind small garrisons in the cities that welcomed him. Left behind memories, too, of a barefoot king who made generals tremble, of a limping man who moved faster than any strategist Persia had faced in a generation. He marched his men back to the coast. As the ships were being prepared, a merchant approached him with a gift, a lacquered box of myrrh and fine Eastern incense. Agesilaus took it, nodded politely, then passed it to a soldier with a bandaged leg. "You've limped enough," he said. "Might as well smell like royalty." The sea was rough that autumn. Several ships nearly overturned near Rhodes, but Agesilaus stood steady on the deck, hands behind his back, cloak soaked through, staring westward. He'd gone to Persia not to conquer, but to warn, and Persia had responded, not with swords, but with coin. He understood now. The next war would not be fought in Asia, it would be fought in every valley of Greece, and every ally had a price. Chapter 5. Victory at a Price. He returned a hero, or so they called him, though the garlands felt wilted and the cheers muted by the weight of what he saw waiting. Sparta was not what he had left. It had grown cautious, paranoid. The confidence of victory had calcified into rigidity. The allies, Thebes, Corinth, Elis, once loyal out of fear, were now restless with resentment. Athens, though defeated a decade ago, was no longer cowed. And everywhere, in whispers and gold coins, Persian influence crept like ivy through the cracks of Greek solidarity. Agesilaus came back to war, but not the clean kind, not the kind with a single front and a noble enemy. This was civil, fractured, a hydra of conflict where friends became rebels and rebels became kings. The so-called Corinthian War had begun, and Sparta was bleeding men it could not replace. The ephors asked him to do the impossible, to hold the line, to punish dissent, to remind Greece that the Lacedaemonian boots still pressed on their throats. He nodded, and went to war again. He led campaigns across Boeotia, into the heartland of Thebes, a city that had once knelt but now rose with new arrogance. There he met resistance not in the field but in terrain. The Thebans fought dirty. Ambushes in the hills, traps on mountain passes. Diplomats turned before swords ever clashed. Agesilaus adapted. He divided his forces, moved by night, studied the old maps of goat paths and trade trails. Where Theban armies waited for a frontal assault, he arrived from behind. Where Corinth thought him encircled, he melted into the fog and struck from within. But each victory grew heavier. The men cheered less. The letters from home grew colder. At Sphacteria, one of his closest officers, a boy who had once slept beside him in Persia, was killed by a stone hurled by a peasant. It was not a glorious death. There was no song for it. Agesilaus buried him himself. When he returned to Sparta that winter, his cloak torn and feet bleeding, the ephors asked for a report. He gave none. He simply looked at the fire, then at the ceiling, and said, "We are winning, but I no longer know what that means." The room was silent. Then an elder said, "Then we must win faster." That was Sparta's answer to everything. And so again, he marched. This time to the north, to Thessaly, a land of horsemen and grain, where Sparta had few friends but many enemies. There, in a skirmish near Larissa, Agesilaus led a cavalry unit despite barely being able to mount a horse himself. He dismounted mid-battle to fight on foot, his limp barely hidden. His soldiers followed not because they feared him, but because they could not bear the shame of watching their king bleed alone. They won, barely. That night he wrote a letter to his daughter, which would never be sent. "I grow tired of being right," he wrote. "The more we win, the less remains. We have crushed the Greeks so well that all that stands now is dust and echo." But war did not pause, and neither did he, until in 394 BCE near Coronea came a battle that changed nothing, but nearly ended everything. Agesilaus faced a coalition of exiled Spartans, Boeotians, and Athenians. The field was wide, the sky overcast. Before the charge, he addressed his men. They outnumber us, but they do not outlast us. Then the horns blew, the phalanxes clashed like jaws. The field turned into mud streaked with red. Agesilaus at the front was pierced in the thigh by a spear. He broke it off, kept fighting. His men saw this and howled, not for blood, for honour. When it ended, Sparta held the field. But Agesilaus could no longer walk without 2 canes. They wanted to carry him on a litter. He refused. He made crutches from spears and hobbled behind the procession of silent victors. In Sparta, they gave him olive branches, but no feast, no statue, only silence. He was still king, but something had shifted. Victory, he learned, was not a prize. It was a debt, and it came due, in blood, in brothers, and in the quiet narrowing of one's own name. Chapter 6. Thebes, Athens, and the Boiling World. It wasn't just war anymore, it was rot. Agesilaus stood on a low ridge outside Thebes and looked down at the land he once called a neighbour. The fields were rich but fallow, the orchards bent under weight they hadn't earned, and the city, proud Thebes, gleamed not with glory but with gold, Persian gold, Athenian gold, gold bought with sons, with resentment, with the growing certainty that Sparta could be beaten. Greece was boiling, not with rage but with something worse, conviction. Athens had rebuilt its fleet, fortified its long walls and grown clever. Thebes had trained a new elite force, the Sacred Band, not just warriors, but lovers paired in death packs of defiance. Corinth plotted with merchants and priests alike, turning religion into rebellion. Argos played both sides. Every polis had learned the same lesson. Sparta could crush you once, but not forever. They had waited, watched, counted the cracks in Sparta's shield, and now they struck. It was not one war, but many. A swirl of skirmishes, sieges, betrayals, and embargoes. Alliances shifted like sand. One day you marched beside a city, the next you burned it. What Agesilaus had seen in Persia, a campaign of clarity, had vanished. Here, there were no clean victories, no obvious enemies. He tried to fight like before, precision, patience, purpose, but every battle cost more. The fields were narrower, the rivers colder, his body slower, his name heavier. At Aulis, he attempted to offer sacrifice to Artemis, an echo of Agamemnon, who had once sailed to Troy. The Thebans mocked him, denied him. He left without ceremony. Some said the gods were done with kings. He smiled at that, then ordered a raid that burned half the Boeotian granaries. In Athens, pamphlets circulated with crude drawings of his limp. Satirical plays made him a villain, a caricature of Spartan cruelty. King Cain, they called him, half man, half spear. He did not respond, but he read them and remembered. In the Spartan assembly, pressure mounted. The ephors demanded results, victories, or at least quiet. But the world was no longer listening to Sparta's demands. It was watching for its mistakes. One came at Lycaeum. A detachment of Spartan troops was ambushed by peltasts, light infantry, while marching in open formation. They were slaughtered. Dozens of elite hoplites, cut down not by superior strength but by speed, cunning and terrain. It shattered the illusion, the myth, that Sparta was invincible. When Agesilaus heard the news, he did not speak. He merely reached for his sandals, rarely worn now, and walked out alone into the hills. He climbed until his legs screamed, then sat and stared at nothing. When a young captain found him hours later and asked what he was doing, Agesilaus said, "Waiting to see if the gods change their minds." But they did not. That year, winter came early. Supplies ran low, the alliances hardened. Persia, now funding the anti-Spartan coalition openly, had turned the Corinthian War into a slow bleed, and Sparta had no navy left to challenge them. Agesilaus turned to diplomacy. He wrote to allies in Asia, to friends in Egypt, even quietly to a few Athenian contacts. Some letters were returned, most were not. He had once been a king of clarity. Now he was a man of requests. He kept marching, into Thessaly again, into Phocis, into the same towns he had passed through 5, 10, 15 years before, once welcomed, now tolerated, sometimes refused. Each campaign was shorter, colder, less decisive, and yet he endured. Because to Agesilaus, endurance had become the only proof of kingship left. One night, beside a freezing stream near Orchomenus, he addressed his officers. "You will hear them say Sparta is finished. Let them. What they forget is this. We have already died once, in Thermopylae, in the plague, in exile, in disgrace. We have buried gods and still marched. We are not here to win, we are here to last." He paused. "And when they forget us, we will return, as dust, as memory, as the crack in their perfect wall." The next day he limped 20 miles without complaint. Thebes never fell, Athens never bowed again. And yet somehow Agesilaus kept Sparta standing. Not glorious, not adored, but standing. And in a world boiling over with betrayal, that, just standing, was its own kind of power. Chapter 7. The War at Home. He had marched through Persia, broken coalitions, stared down kings and gods. But Agesilaus was not ready for this. The war at home, it began quietly, a muttering in the mess halls, a refusal to salute, a hesitation in the helots' eyes, nothing treasonous, just different. As if something had shifted in the marrow of Sparta itself. He was nearly 60, his leg ached with the seasons, his breath was shallower in the mornings, yet still he rose with the sun, still trained with the young, still walked the perimeter barefoot. But his shadow no longer inspired awe. It reminded people of age, of cost, of decay. The helots, the enslaved underclass that made the Spartan miracle possible, were no longer silent. Some fled, others fought. Small rebellions flared along the Eurotas, fields were burned, food was stolen. One group barricaded themselves in a cliffside village, holding off Spartan soldiers for days. Agesilaus rode out personally, limping, cloaked in the dust of memory. He did not issue orders, he listened. "Why now?" he asked a captured rebel, barely more than a boy. The boy did not spit, did not curse, he only said, "Because your war is not ours." The king said nothing. He had no answer. The allies fared no better. Old friends like Elis and Phocis demanded more silver for fewer soldiers. Thebes was hostile. Athens flirted with open war again. Sparta, once feared for its dominance, was now resented for its demands. The empire was a chain of reluctant partners, each link rusting. Even within the Gerousia, Sparta's council of elders, there was dissent. Some questioned Agesilaus's endless campaigning. Others criticized his humility, which they now labelled weakness. A few dared whisper the unthinkable, that the king who marched everywhere had perhaps led Sparta nowhere. But the loudest voice came from a ghost, Lysander. He had returned from quiet exile, not in arms, but in rhetoric. He spoke in assemblies, wrote to foreign dignitaries, painted Agesilaus as a failed experiment. The king of patience, Lysander said, had become a king of paralysis. He proposed reforms, redistribution, a new Spartan order. Agesilaus watched from the back of the hall as his old ally raised his arms to thunderous applause. He did not speak, not that night. Instead, he waited, then moved. Within a month, Lysander was dead. A skirmish on the border, an ambush, an arrow no one could trace, officially an accident, unofficially a message. The council did not question it, but Sparta grew colder. One morning, Agesilaus walked through the Agyei, the training grounds of Spartan youth, and found fewer boys, fewer trainers. The songs of discipline had grown thin. The rhythm of Sparta was faltering. He asked a tutor why. "Too many fathers lost," the man said. "And the mothers?" Agesilaus asked. "Too many silences," the man replied. At night, the king walked the walls alone. No guards, just the wind, and the echoes of 100 victories that now felt like debts unpaid. He dreamed often of Persia, not the battles, but the clarity. There at least the lines were clean. There he had known what was enemy and what was home. Now everything blurred. He wrote to Egypt requesting support. Spartan coffers were thinning. No silver, no army, no peace. He hated the letter, hated the asking. But he sealed it anyway, with wax that bore the mark of a king too proud to beg and too old to wait. The reply would take months. Meanwhile Sparta cracked. There were riots, small ones, broken market stalls, scuffles between citizens and freedmen. An old veteran spat on a magistrate and was beaten in public, not for the insult, but for being noticed. Discipline had become performance, order, an illusion. One day a young boy approached Agesilaus as he sat watching the river. "Are you really a king?" he asked. Agesilaus nodded. "You don't look like one." "I don't feel like one," he answered. The boy blinked. "Then why are you still here?" Agesilaus didn't reply. The boy left. He remained. Because sometimes a king is not the one who rules, but the one who refuses to abandon the ruins. In the winter of that year, a minor earthquake struck near Mount Taygetus. No one was hurt, but the temple of Apollo cracked. Some said it was an omen. Agesilaus walked to the broken stones. He sat beneath the fractured lintel and whispered a prayer. Not for victory, not for Sparta, but for time, just a little more. Enough to hold the centre. Enough to hand the wreckage to someone who might still build from it. Because even in war, there is duty. And even in defeat, there is honour. And even at home, especially at home, a king must endure. Chapter 8. The Old Lion Still Bites. They expected him to retire. He didn't. He could barely walk without the twin canes now, carved from the same spears he once carried into battle. His hair was white, skin tough as leather, voice more gravel than thunder. But the old lion still bit. In 361 BCE, a delegation arrived from Egypt. They brought gifts, gold, spices, letters stamped with wax. Egypt, caught in its own tangled rebellion, sought foreign help. Not soldiers, not an army, a mind, a name, a general whose very presence could steady the sand. They asked for Agesilaus. He was 73. The Spartan council debated. Some scoffed, others shrugged. "Let the old man go," they said. What could he still do? Agesilaus said nothing, but he packed. He did not bring ceremony, only his sword, his staff. A letter from his daughter folded into the lining of his cloak. When he left Sparta, the streets did not cheer. No procession, just a few glances, half pity, half reverence. It was winter when he arrived in Egypt. The delta smelled of papyrus and sweat, the sun ablaze on every surface. He squinted into the brightness, smiled thinly, and set to work. The Egyptian king, Teos, greeted him in person. "You are smaller than I imagined," Teos said. "You're younger than I hoped," Agesilaus replied. There was tension. Teos wanted to use Agesilaus as a mascot, a foreign symbol to rally the army. But the Spartan came not to be paraded. He studied the troops, found their weaknesses, dismissed half the generals. When Teos protested, Agesilaus said, "You hired a commander, not a decoration." Then he restructured the entire campaign. Under his guidance, Egyptian forces began to reclaim rebellious provinces, not with brute force but precision. Forts were retaken, supply lines resecured, villages restored. For a moment, the sand itself seemed to still, but success breeds suspicion. Teos grew jealous, afraid that the old foreigner might become too beloved, too essential. He began undercutting plans, redirecting forces, whispering to the court. Agesilaus saw the trap. He defected, not to Persia, not to enemies, to another Egyptian faction led by Nectanebo-Thexen, a rival claimant to the throne. The Egyptians were stunned. Sparta had changed sides mid-campaign, and yet the loyalty of Agesilaus' soldiers remained with him. Within months, Teos was ousted, Nectanebo crowned, and Agesilaus, he was paid 230 talents of silver, enough to keep Sparta afloat for years. He did not ask for thanks, only for ships. He was going home, but his body, faithful for decades, had begun to fail. At the port of Cyrene in Libya, he fell ill. The heat pierced him. He grew thin, stumbled more, slept longer. On the 10th night, he summoned a scribe and dictated one last letter. Not to the ephors, not to the council, to the agoge, to the boys. He wrote, "Be strong but not cruel, be silent but not blind, walk barefoot not because you must, but because it teaches you where the world is rough. If you bleed, do it for something larger than your name, and when Sparta forgets you, as it will, walk anyway." He died the next morning, no crown, no anthem, no last words. His body was embalmed in wax, sealed in a wooden coffin, and placed aboard a Spartan trireme bound for home. When it arrived, the docks were silent. No hero's welcome, just the creak of rope, the slap of tide, and the whisper of a name that had once made kings pause. Agesilaus, the old lion, still biting, even in death. Chapter 9. Death in a Foreign Land. They say the sea was calm that day. The ship carrying Agesilaus drifted along the Libyan coast, sail slack with grief. No drums, no chants, only the hush of waves brushing wood and the groan of time moving forward without the man who had defied it for so long. His body lay sealed in wax, the ancient Spartan method for long returns. Salted cloths wrapped him tight, his spear rested beside him, not a weapon now, but a relic. And around him silence reigned, not just on the ship, but in the thoughts of every man aboard. No one knew what would await them at Sparta. A monument? A whisper? An order to bury him quickly with no song? No one said it, but many feared this, that Agesilaus, king of Sparta, would die twice, once in Libya and again in memory. The sailors kept to their tasks. The commander, a young officer who had once trained under Agesilaus, sat by the coffin each dusk and recited lines from Tyrtaeus, the war poet of old. It is beautiful to die for one's city, but he never finished the verse. Back in Sparta the mood was brittle, the wars had quieted, not from peace, but from exhaustion. The treasury, bloated by Agesilaus' Egyptian silver, had already begun to shrink again. The ephors met less frequently, the Agogia recruited fewer boys, and in the temples the gods waited, as they always did, to be remembered or forgotten. When the news arrived, it came not with ceremony but with a letter. Agesilaus is dead. His body approaches. No eulogy, no embellishment, just fact. Agesilaus would have preferred it that way. Still, when the ship docked, something stirred. An old woman came first, the widow of a soldier lost in Boeotia. She brought a flower. Then a boy, limping from an accident, came to see the king who had made limpness into legend. Then others, veterans, helots, even foreigners. Not in great number, but not none. They watched as the coffin was lifted. The soldiers did not carry him like a king. They carried him like a brother. Through the streets he had once walked barefoot, past the training grounds, now empty, past the market, where boys now played instead of drilled, to the edge of the city, where the dead watched the living forget. There, a pyre had been built. Simple. No carvings, no idols. A young girl stepped forward. She was not of noble blood, but she had memorized something her tutor once said, something Agesilaus had whispered to a soldier long ago. She recited it now. Glory is not what they say about you after. It is the walk itself, the mud, the silence, the limp. Then the fire was lit. The flames took their time, as if even they could not quite bring themselves to finish him. When morning came, nothing remained but ash and a spear. The council asked what to do with it. A boy, too young for politics, said quietly, "Let it stand in the Agoge, not as a weapon, but as a promise." They did, and years later, when Sparta truly fell, when its walls crumbled and its name faded from power, that spear remained. Weathered, forgotten, but still standing, just like him. Chapter 10. The echo of the Lacedaemonians in years past, then decades, and Sparta, that stone-walled myth of discipline and conquest, began to erode. Not all at once, not in a final battle, but slowly, like cliffs eaten by the sea. Other cities rose. Thebes had its golden moment. Macedon, a northern shadow, grew fangs under a man named Philip, and soon a boy named Alexander would inherit a world hungry for kings. But Agesilaus, he did not rise with them. He lingered only in the margins. Philosophers debated him. Xenophon, the Athenian who had fought beside him in Asia, wrote glowingly of his character, his frugality, his piety, his tactical mind. Others disagreed. They called him stubborn, obsolete, a man who dragged Sparta into wars it couldn't afford and left it hollow. Too long a reign, said some. Too small a vision, said others. But still, his story remained. Not because of conquest, because of contradiction. He was the limping king of a city that worshipped symmetry, the humble ruler of a land that measured worth by arrogance. He fought more wars than any Spartan before him, and yet his greatest legacy was that he refused to die in one. Children born long after his death heard fragments, that he walked without shoes, that he wept when no one else would, that he once slept in the dirt beside his men even as gold glinted in his tent. In the Agauge, instructors pointed to a lone spear mounted on a wall. They didn't say his name, they just said, "That's what endures." In Athens, a playwright composed a tragedy loosely based on him, called The One Who Walked Backwards. It was never performed, too quiet, too slow, but in private circles it was whispered, "This is the first time I've cried for a Spartan." Time has always made a myth, and myths are both prisons and wings. Some used Agesilaus as proof that Sparta had once been great, others that Sparta had always been doomed. But somewhere in the shifting silence of history, his echo remained. Not loud, not lion-like, just steady, like a footfall on old stone, like a whisper through dry grass, like the memory of a man who walked further than glory ever asked him to, and kept going. Not because he believed he would be remembered, but because he believed someone still had to walk.